Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share my full review, the digitally digested segment, for the Microsoft Surface Duo 2. Now, when Microsoft set out to launch the original Duo, they came to market expensive, with dated internals, and quite frankly, a beautiful device with a questionable future. Here in the second generation, they've upped the ante by not only raising the price $100 from $1,400 to $1,500 for the base 128 gig version that I'm reviewing here, that I've spent nearly a month with, but they also improved all of the internals that in that first generation were sorely lacking. So we now have a Snapdragon 888 processor, 8 gigs of RAM, again 128 gigs of storage. We now have 5G connectivity, which did not exist on the first generation. That was a big drawback for many consumers, not myself, but for many. After all, you do have to have 5G in your market, but these days most of the US is gaining that, slowly but surely. They also increased the size of these displays, their 4:3 aspect ratio AMOLEDs, and also, more importantly, made them 90 hertz, something that in today's day and age, high refresh has become somewhat of a standard on luxury and high-end handsets. So that was definitely a welcomed improvement. They also listened to customer feedback regarding cameras, because the original, as many of you know, had a selfie camera here that also doubled as essentially, well, it was the only camera on the device. Here, they've added 3 more on the camera module that has been essentially glued to the back of the device, giving it 2 more 12 megapixel cameras, as well as a 16 megapixel ultra wide, the other being standard and telephoto. And I do think that they've moved in the right direction. If you want to take on the competition, if you want to turn the Surface Duo into a line that won't be just a niche device, but something that everyone may want or must have, this is the way to do it. And going up in price $100, I think, is reasonable considering how much they've improved the hardware. Also important here, they've improved the software. When the Duo launched originally, Android did not support, at least natively, multiple displays, which for a device made of 2 displays is a big problem. Of course, here out of the box we have Android 11, which does support it, but that doesn't mean that we're looking at a perfect piece of hardware. I think, in fact, software, ironically, even though Microsoft is the largest software company in the world, is still the one thing holding this device back. And by one, I mean key. There are other issues with it that I'll get to through the course of this review, but that is, I think, the lingering one that if remedied, if rectified, this will be a device that over time, as it matures and changes, just like it did from the first to the second generation, many people will want. So, of course, the thing that makes this unique is multitasking, and that is what it excels at. The cameras that have been added, they're better than, of course, the single camera from last generation, but I wouldn't say that they really differentiate this device because ultimately they are just okay, which is disappointing because a lot of people do complain about the fact that now when you, of course, do what I just did, which is fold the displays out so that you can utilize it in a single-handed mode, it no longer can be closed flush like Gen 1. Now, I don't see a huge issue with that, but I understand why people are bothered by it. This is a device that is aesthetically pleasing, has really nice design language, and here Microsoft has essentially stuck a wart on the back that now prevents the device from doing something seamlessly that it did in Gen 1. And I don't think that that was a great move simply because, as I just mentioned, the cameras on this device aren't excellent. And this draws attention to those cameras, in addition to the fact that it physically can no longer close flush. So, I mean, had they actually given us some, not best in class, but close to best in class cameras that could actually hold a candle to Samsung, Apple, and Google, then I think this would be a lot easier to swallow. But in the current form and the camera quality being taken into account, this is, I think, for many unacceptable, and that's without even the cameras being good or bad. So just food for thought. Again, this doesn't really bother me. It wouldn't prevent me from buying this phone. But the fact that these cameras are really more of for show than actual use, in that they can't perform the way that they should on a $1,500 flagship style device, that is a letdown. Now, when it comes to overall build quality, this phone is still excellent, just as it was in the first generation, incredibly thin. It has, I would say, decent battery life, not excellent battery life, which is unfortunate. And that's something that we can hope will be improved, but it is excellent considering its form factor. This is I think, the thinnest 5G device on the market, but it is actually heavier than my Z Fold 3. And of course, you have pen support with the Slim Pen 2, but bear in mind that will set you back another $130 plus the case you'll need for the wireless charging for the Duo 2. That's another $65, so $200 plus tax approximately, in addition to that $1,500 base price in order to have successful pen input. That's the way I would put it. So multitasking is what differentiates this device from everything else. Now here, I just have two web browsers going clearly, which is not a game-changing thing, but it is in terms of the actual span of each one of these, really making them more usable than any device on the market. And that includes my Z Fold 3. My Z Fold 3 has a 7.6-inch 120 hertz internal display that is gorgeous and is continuous, unlike, of course, these two displays, but you knew that out of the box, right? No one actually thinks this is a continuous display. I think it's a little bit misleading that Microsoft markets it as a 8.3-inch internal display. They shouldn't do that because consumers then come to expect something that really can be used in a continuous capacity. And when you actually do that and span the display, well, the experience leaves a lot to be desired. No matter whether you use it in landscape or portrait, you're just not going to get something that, in my opinion, is worth using. Of course, we didn't even have an auto rotation there, but that's neither here nor there. So let's go ahead and get rid of this, and let's talk about more multitasking. In my opinion, this needs more software support in that realm, and I think it will come over time. And I mean native support, not opening Edge and Chrome at the same time. But part of the beauty is, and I think this is one of the best applications, but there's one of the bugs you're seeing right now already, is the camera app. And this, unfortunately, is a very good example of the point I was making at the top of this video about the software, its stability, and whether or not it's really ready for prime time, because clearly this is not the way the camera app is supposed to launch, and it's still bugging out. This, the actual camera preview should be on the right, and the gallery should be on the left. But as you can see, it isn't functioning. And now it finally is on, was that the third time that I opened it up? And this is one of its best implementations, even though it completely missed there multiple times. But I really enjoy using the camera from this perspective. We just need a better camera array than what Microsoft has here. And the other part that's kind of ridiculous about this is that, of course, cameras on phones have improved due to computational software, not so much, obviously, leveraging larger sensors or faster glass. So this is something Microsoft really could just throw money at and improve upon. And hopefully they will, but I do really like having this gallery view on one side and, of course, being able to take your shots on the other. I think this is ideal. My Z Fold 3 does something like this, but it's not executed as well. Of course, on the other hand, the Z Fold 3's cameras are miles better than what you will get out of this device. And look, I'm going to stay away from comparing it, but it's inherent. There's only one device that really does draw comparison, and it's the Fold, and for good reason. Even though this doesn't have a folding display, and the Fold will attract more enthusiast-type customers that are attracted to technology rather than what this is aiming to do, which is bring you two independent displays on a single device, the market will compare them because they share very similar price points, nearly identical internals, and really represent some of the best hardware on the market here in 2021. So the cameras I've mentioned, they're decent. They're not awful, and that's a good thing because in the previous generation, they were awful. The one, I mean. You tend to forget there was only one. It was incredibly awkward to use. You could not seamlessly take a photo with it, and so many people defended it, basically claiming they didn't care whether it had cameras, and that's fine. If you don't care about whether the device has cameras, I respect that, but the market doesn't, and the majority of consumers that Microsoft wants to acquire this, they're looking for a device that's going to have mass adoption, mass appeal, The days of thinking this is just for one sort of customer that lives in a gray space, those days are over. In order for this to succeed, which I want to see it succeed, we need to have a device that everybody is going to want to buy. And by everyone, I don't mean literally everyone, but a large enough consumer base to keep the project afloat and hopefully eventually see a Neo one of these days. But it's serviceable, and maybe that's all that's necessary these days. Because, personally, I don't rely on my smartphone, the Z Fold 3, to be my primary camera, but it is my go everywhere camera, and that's important. So the fact that I know I can rely on it in any situation is good. Now, this is a low light shot. It came out fairly well, but incredibly tough to get a decent low light picture out of this. I will tell you that, while Barks was chilling in his crate. So the camera's a good example. It also, unfortunately, ended up being a good example of the software problems that this phone is still dealing with in its second generation, even with some of the best hardware that money can buy, figuratively and literally. So what does it not do well besides the software and the camera array? Battery life, it does better than the previous generation, which is a good thing because the screens did get larger, higher refresh rate. And I think Microsoft was really smart to go with 90 hertz, not necessarily 120, because I think that's a sweet spot of sorts. Now, if you can pull off 120 and maintain battery life, kudos. Most manufacturers cannot. But my Z Fold 3 does still outlast this device. So with that said, I'm not blown away by the battery life here, even if it's a slight improvement over the previous generation. Now, when it comes to the form factor, again, nothing else like it on the market. I mean, LG was the last manufacturer to give us dual screen devices, and it was an accessory. It wasn't out of the box as dual screen, and it was a flop. And that means Microsoft has a lot to do here to truly differentiate and make this appealing. Now, they didn't revolutionize any technology here. That's why they like to talk about how thin it is. And I think that's a little bit passé. Even though I really like the design, it's just not something worth bragging about these days. I would rather them focus on giving us some form of front screen display, because not having one, I think, is detrimental to the success of the Surface Duo 2. It's just something where always having to open this up isn't practical. And with Gen 1, I get it. It was a floater. It was a test. Here in Gen 2, it seemed like Microsoft was listening to the market, but yet somehow we still have no external display. Now, some of you will say that's unnecessary. You could use a smartwatch. That's fine if you want to do that. That's not going to be fine for mass consumption. The majority of consumers are not going to want to have to buy a watch, or they may already own one. That isn't the point. I mean, I own several, as you might imagine. It still isn't going to be a way to fix a design flaw. And that's what I view this as. This is all about the aesthetic, not about functionality. That is a problem. You look at the first gen Z Flip from Samsung. It was a single line essential readout OLED on the front. That has gone the way of extinction as a result of feedback from customers and Samsung realizing it was not really doable. The same applies to the Z Fold. Gen 1 display was fairly small. Gen 2, they rectified that. And that was because, in spite of whatever they thought was right on day one, consumers told them otherwise. So I think Microsoft needs to wake up on this one. They clearly were willing to sacrifice the aesthetic for the camera hump. I think it would be far more functional to sacrifice that aesthetic, and I don't think it would be really a sacrifice to give us a front display of some sort. Now, the glance bar is something, and some will argue it's better than nothing. I'll agree with that, but it is so small that it really isn't that compelling. In fact, I think most people will need reading glasses or glasses in general to actually see the information that comes out of the glance bar. And the glance bar is really just a product of the curved displays, essentially creating that wedge that can slide out some info to you. I think it was an ingenious way of providing some form of notification bar, but the reality is that it is not a game changer at all, and it's kind of difficult to work with. That's in my opinion. And I wear glasses already to correct my vision so I can see it perfectly, but in many instances I've had to strain. So, that's not the best method, in other words. So I still think this would benefit tremendously from that. Also, wireless charging. Now, look, If this was 5 years ago, they could get away with this. But after Apple even joined the club of wireless charging, that made it a wide adoption program, essentially, because while Apple had not brought Qi charging to the world of their own consumer base, that essentially meant that a huge chunk of the mobile computing world, when it came to handsets, were pretending or simply were unaware that wireless charging was a thing, let alone a good thing. And I remember the days when Apple used to say they were concerned that it would be too complicated for their customer base. It would confuse them. Well, surely that's not the case anymore. In fact, at this point, with the wide, again, abundance of Qi charging on handsets, this kind of feels like a second-class device, because even if you don't use wireless charging, it's something that, for me, has become first nature, not second. Granted, when I need a quick charge on my phone, I'm going to plug it in. But in every other case, wireless charging is convenient and is my primary choice. There's no reason to have to plug it in if I don't have to plug it in. With this device, you're going to have to. And the fact that the charging is capped at 23 watts is not a great selling point either. That's something that I don't really take tremendous issue with, but a lot of consumers will, because it's yet another area that a corner was clearly cut. I used to think that Samsung was doing the wrong thing a few years ago when they launched the Fold and then Fold 2, and they didn't, give us high-speed charging that they could have, even here in its third generation. I still could argue about that, but surely it's not 23 watts. And that's where, again, I'm reminded of Microsoft really focused on the things that they thought they couldn't get away with this round. And that's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. They need to do that in order to get on par. If they want to sell these devices, they have to, at the very least, deliver hardware that competes directly with the competition. If they don't do that, they can, wish and dream all they want. This device will not sell itself with a meager spec sheet. It's just not possible. And if you know anything about the experience on the first generation Duo, it wasn't just a matter of the specs being underwhelming. The performance was horrendous. This device, the performance is night and day, but still, as you've already seen, software is holding it back. And I really wish that wasn't the case. Another issue I have with this in general is the IP rating, or lack thereof. IPX1, we do not have water resistance, and that is something that even the Z Fold 3 has. Granted, Gen 1 and Gen 2 did not. The third gen does, just like pen input. So really, that's part of the reason that this is going to draw a solid direct comparison to the Z Fold 2 in many ways rather than the 3, because, again, wireless charging, better battery life, better cameras, pen input, those are all elements of the Z Fold 3 that are not going to happen here. The pen input will, but nothing else that I just mentioned. So all things you have to take into account with this. It's a really nice device. It isn't a game changer in terms of it being a clamshell with two displays, but it is in terms of there is not a single other smartphone on the market right now that I can point you at, other than its previous generation, that delivers the dual screen experience that this does. But again, how important is that multitasking excellence that it brings? I mean, I think it's fantastic. I can see myself using it every day. The problem is the group of issues that this phone still has, I think, are essentially holding it back from being a primary device. And what that means is that this is going to be a great secondary device, but not a great primary. And that's what brings me to thinking that the Neo is where this concept is really going to excel, if we ever actually see that come to fruition. Because the Neo will deliver, first of all, larger displays, and it will be a Wi-Fi device. I think that Microsoft could do themselves a big favor by launching a Wi-Fi only version of the Duo 2 at a much lower price, and people would pick this up as a secondary device, something complementary to their smartphone. In my case, someone who owns a Z Fold 3, they're not going to be as apt to pick one of these up as a secondary device, clearly. But if you own a traditional candy bar, Android or iOS, I can see why you'd want to have one of these with you traveling, on the road, even at home. Of course, in a perfect world, the displays would be larger because that would make the multitasking experience even better. That would make using the Slim Pen 2 more dynamic. So just food for thought. That's really what I feel needs to be done in order to turn the Duo 2 into a practical everyday device. But as long as we're dealing with software bugs, most importantly, on a device that's pitched around being multitasking centric, we've got a major problem. As a phone, the battery life, as I've stated, is acceptable. But to not have, again, water resistance on something that feels like it's built so well, and that also, as I've mentioned, is heavier than my Z Fold 3, is not really acceptable in this day and age. It's something that if Microsoft can't fix, it might be time to go back to the drawing board. And I don't think that would be a bad idea. I mean, what I've been talking about things like notifications, and there you have it. You know, the glance bar can give you a glance, but they called it a glance for a reason. You're not going to get much more. And while what Microsoft did with the curved displays made it so less data was lost in spanning, it's still not practical, obviously, for spanning. So, as I stated earlier in the video, Microsoft really needs to let the spanning concept go. Not in that you can't do it, but do not market about the internal real estate corner to corner. That's just a bad idea. It seems deceptive. It did in Gen 1. It seems exactly the same here in Gen 2. If they can actually make cameras that, as I stated, will be nearly as good as the competition, I think people will be far less irked by this bump hump, okay? That is an important step in the right direction. I'm not saying it will eliminate people from complaining about this form factor, because it won't, meaning the fact that it can't go flush, but it will at least provide some sort of trade-off, some form of compensation for this strange new form factor that it's taken. And for me personally, I still feel like this device is just a little bit too wide for single-handed use. You know, granted, if you have really large hands, it will be better in terms of experience than what I'm getting out of it. But that doesn't really change the fact that when I put this to my head, I feel ridiculous in terms of taking a phone call. So this is all, you know, food for thought, things I think people need to know. Another thing I want to mention is that even though this is capped at 23 watts, the Type-C charging port, I've connected 65-watt chargers expecting it to still be able to charge it. Of course, not at 65 watts, and it cannot. Now, that's something I don't experience on my Z Fold 3, Z Fold 2, my Z Flip. So again, whatever Microsoft is doing there, it seems like they're using the least expensive internals where they can get away with it. And that's why I make mention of it again. So how does it compare to the Z Fold 3? I've stayed away from that, even though I've made mention through this video multiple times. Let's actually discuss it, because, you know, it is a practical discussion for anyone who's looking at both devices, and they are two of, at least in my opinion, the most impressive devices here in 2021. So essentially, with the Z Fold 3, which I have right here, granted it has a case on it, you've got 120 hertz external display that, while narrow, gives you essentially the same experience of a flagship candy bar phone. And then, of course, open it up, and you have the tablet in your pocket. You know, you can easily multitask on here. The software is fairly flawless. You will not run into any of the bugs that you will on the Duo. The screen is brighter, roughly 1,000 nits versus 800 nits on the dual displays. Higher pixel density on the Duo, but we do have a continuous display here. And for every person that says once you split screen this, the displays are too narrow, look, I can't argue that the Duo is not a more usable form factor for multitasking, because 4:3 aspect ratio, over 5-inch AMOLED 90 hertz panels there, with higher pixel density when you total them out together, but they still can't accomplish this. And I would always rather personally have a continuous display that I split using software than a physical one that ultimately ends up being more of a hindrance than a blessing. And I say that because if that's the source of the reason Microsoft can't give us water and dust resistance, we can't get complete information spanned. If that matters to you, not necessarily more than the split screen multitasking experience that you get out of the Duo, but if it comes close to being a 50-50 equal importance to you, then this is the phone that's going to solve those problems. This is the phone that will make you think you can almost get there, and just you're going to come up short like this much. So also things to consider with the Z Fold 3. Besides it having better software, you have better battery life, you have better cameras, you have wireless charging, the water resistance. I've mentioned all of this. These are big things. Of course, both phones have 5G, NFC, but just those elements that I just mentioned, those are core components that the Z Fold 3 just destroys the Duo 2 in. Battery life, for many of you, anyone that would argue as a business user how important the experiences that the Duo delivers, surely you would not make the argument that battery life would not matter. Whether you're a road warrior or an executive that travels here and there, battery life is not something to be taken lightly. So this isn't about the profile of the consumer. This is about, again, what are I would say general expectations of a high-end, incredibly powerful device. Both have the Snapdragon 888, 8 gigs of RAM, 12 gigs of RAM, incredibly similar price points. The Z Fold 3 is only a little bit more expensive. And then when you take into account that the pen is so much less expensive, well, that is moot. Also, this doesn't need to charge. Also, you have a continuous display to draw on. And the pen experience is excellent on the Z Fold 3. Granted, you do still have the crease. You won't feel it for the most part, which is a big deal. The fingerprint scanner, excellent here. That's one thing I didn't mention. Microsoft did do a pretty decent solid here with improving the fingerprint scanner this generation, and they deserve credit for that. Neither is expandable when it comes to storage, so that's a letdown in both instances, in my opinion. You do have an additional camera here rather than the 4. You have a total of 5, 1 here, 3 here, and then, of course, another here. And every single one of these cameras, except for the under-display camera, which, of course, from a technology standpoint, is more impressive than, again, anything you're going to see on the Duo, because it does adapt and blend in, and it's still serviceable for video conferencing. They're all better, for the most part, in overall performance. So hopefully that helps you figure things out. I mean, personally, I'm happy that I went with the Z Fold 3. There's a reason that here in the third generation, Sammy has a winner yet again. Gen 1 was rocky. Gen 2 was solid. I mean, I have my Gen 2 right here. I would pick the Gen 2 over the Duo 2. And again, as a device in its complete form. I'm not saying that the Duo 2 can't do a better job multitasking than the Z Fold line. It can. I think that, the Z Fold, if anything, Samsung should be keeping an eye on Microsoft and taking notes when it comes to that. But, and I mean from a software interface standpoint, but from a stability standpoint, Microsoft needs to do everything in their power to try to get even close to where Samsung is these days. And I'm not comparing it to Apple because these are both driven by Android, and that is, the common thread between the two devices. So, again, I'm all for the Z Fold 3. It's lighter than the Duo, more dynamic for my personal use. And again, when I want to split it and multitask, I can. But at the end of the day, I still have that continuous internal display, which for me is more important than having two larger, wider, independent screens that cannot be combined and ultimately is unfortunately driven by an inferior software experience. Now, if it were different, that would be a different story, but it's not. Again, build quality is excellent. Specs are finally where they need to be a flagship phone that garners the price that it does, but there are just too many things missing from the experience still, in my opinion. And that's where Microsoft needs to really bump things up, and they can do it. They've got the money. They're one of the largest corporations in the world. And I really hope that they do, because at its current state, I don't see the Duo sticking around much longer. Gen 1, it went from $1,400 to $400 in the matter of a year on sale. And this is probably going to go in the exact same direction. I have not heard anything good about sales on this. I've already seen some actual sales on it, some price drops. So it may be a mere 6 months before this gets to clearance levels, 8 months before it's like giveaway time. And that's sad because it is a beautiful piece of hardware, limited by software and, again, usability between its width, no display on the front. I keep hammering that home because I just don't know what Microsoft was thinking coming back and essentially giving this device what it needed in Gen 1, but only from an internal spec. When you look at the Z Fold and what they did from Gen 1 to Gen 2, it wasn't about addressing internal specifications because Sammy got that right on day one. It was all about, in fact, Sammy went overboard on internal specifications. Instead, it was all about responding to what consumers wanted, and that was a larger external display. And then in the third gen, a pen and water resistance. And they were able to get away with giving, less quality when it came to cameras, internal storage in the second generation. They bumped the internal storage back up in Gen 3, but they still aren't giving the best camera array that they have in their arsenal. So they've made it clear that you don't need to put the best of everything in the device. You just need to listen to consumers. And I think that's still something that Microsoft, unfortunately, is failing to do with the Duo 2, because there's not one person you'll meet that will tell you this is ugly or it's a piece of crap. They will tell you that the software experience is far from ever being something they would want to use on a daily basis. And people who love it, there's nothing wrong with that, obviously, but there just aren't enough of them to keep this project going, even if Microsoft is willing to bleed. And so that's why I hope the changes happen. I'm a huge Microsoft fan, in spite of what anybody may think. And this is an extension of the Surface lineup that I hope ends up being what it ultimately could be. I mean, at present, I don't see it happening. I do feel like it's a matter of time for the Duo before it's put to bed. And that's why I've mentioned, as a Wi-Fi device, I think it has a really good spot to occupy. But in its current form, as a $1,500 phone, that another $200 to get the case and pen so that the pen will charge, you're going into territory that is really rough. And pricing isn't the problem. It's just that if it's at this price, it's got to be a finished product. And with the software, I'm going to see if the camera opens again. You have it again. It's just, it isn't functioning. And say what you will, people who are in love, are often blinded by that love. It's just a matter of fact. And I hope that, won't remain the case, because this really could be a device for everyone. But the bugginess is what's holding it back. So hopefully Microsoft gets to that. And if they can fix the camera array, improve battery life, give us wireless charging, water resistance, as well as, just a device that really people will be happy with as their primary device, I think this is going to be a winner. And I love the new color, but the fingerprint magnet stuff, well, you see what it looks like. Enough said. But either way, a great phone with huge potential, just like last generation, except miles better in every single way, but not in its form and function capability overall. Microsoft still can fix this. Let's see if they will. Let's hope that they do, and let's hope that the Neo ends up surfacing at some point, because I think that will be the way that we will ultimately realize the full potential of the multi-monitor setup coming to a smartphone or a laptop or just a tablet form, which is where I would personally like to see it. But still going in the right direction. But as much as has been improved, we're still dealing with the same issues. Software. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. Hit that like button. And as usual, please feel free to subscribe, and please stay safe. Later.